Hi guys, and welcome to the A-Level Economists in particular. What I'm going to do in the next number of videos, which I'll try and release on a daily basis over the next number of weeks as you prepare for your final exams, is to go through the specification and first of all to cover off any of the topic areas which I do not have in my playlist already, and also to provide you hopefully with a little bit of a revision video for each section of the specification. Now of course I am working with OCR, and so that is the focus of all of these videos which follow. So let's get stuck into today's, and this is beginning with the very first section of the microeconomic specification, where we are considering this whole notion of scarcity and choice. The specification identifies the following 7 areas in the first section and asks you to distinguish between economic goods and free goods, to explain what's meant by the basic economic problem, to distinguish between positive and normative statements, to distinguish between a need and a want, to consider the problems associated with making choices, to consider the role of economic agents, and then finally to consider the factors of production and the returns to those factors of production. So I'm going to take each of these in turn and just say a little bit about it and possibly draw some diagrams as we go. So first of all, let's just consider the heading, this whole notion of scarcity and choice. And let's have a think about what it is that are scarce. So in economics, we refer to the fact that it is the resources that are scarce. Now, those resources could be financial in the terms of a household, or they could of course be natural resources, so things such as oil, for example, which are not infinite, they are finite and they are running out. So when we talk about scarcity, we are referring to resources being scarce, i.e. at some point they will all be used up, be that your own individual income or a household's income or a natural resource. Now if it is the case that resources are scarce, and let's just consider the resources of the household, which would be the income. If incomes are scarce, then that clearly means that you cannot have and you cannot consume, and the household cannot consume, everything which it might potentially want. And as a consequence of that, decisions and choices have to be made. And of course, in choosing one item over another, you're giving up something in return for consuming something else. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So that is this whole notion of scarcity and choice. So let's take each of these points now in turn. Economic goods and free goods. So most goods that you consume that provide you with some sort of utility or satisfaction, they would be referred to as as economic goods. They usually come with a financial cost associated with them, and also an opportunity cost. And it's usually the case that in order to buy some economic goods of one kind or another, you will ultimately, in your own mind, have to make a decision to give up other goods and or services because you do not have the resources necessary to consume all of the economic goods that you might actually want. Now, of course, there are some lucky people in this world for whom that is not the case. Is that lucky or not? I'm not sure. That, of course, differs from this whole notion of free goods. There are very few goods in the world nowadays which are free. So air, water, they are in abundant supply. And of course, the water, even in some countries, that is not a free good because it is very scarce. If we think about our notion of developing economies, for example. So free goods are abundant in supply, but even those, as you will know from your studies of negative externalities, they may be abundant, but the actual the actual fact that they are free means that people don't take the necessary care, and as a consequence of that we end up with a free good such as clean air being polluted, and then we get highly polluted air. And of course you will be well aware that that is a market failure in economics because of a missing market, and so a market has to be created. But that is the general difference. Economic goods, financial cost, opportunity cost associated. That's obviously not the case with the free good, because when it's free, it's not actually costing you any financial resource. Okay, the basic economic problem. Let's just talk about this a little bit more. So the basic economic problem is scarcity. And what is it that is scarce? That are scarce? Resources are scarce. Now, in order to purchase a good and or service that you may want, you have to use your resources, but you do not necessarily have the resources required to buy everything that you want, because as you know from your studies of economics, wants are said to be infinite. So we have a problem here in that wants are infinite, but resources are scarce, or another way of putting that would be to say that resources are finite. And as a consequence of that, clearly you have to make choices. Now when I say you have to make choices, who do I mean? Well, I mean consumers, households, governments. The economic agents need to make choices. And so this is this whole notion of the basic economic problem. And the fact that whenever you decide to consume one good or service, you're generally giving up another one, and the thing that you're giving up, the thing that you're foregoing, is the opportunity cost. If I have £10 and I wish to buy either 2 copies of The Economist or Professor Joseph Stiglitz's latest book, well, if I consume and purchase Joseph Stiglitz's latest book, I cannot consume The Economist, and that then becomes the opportunity cost. The next best alternative foregone. Point number 3, positive and normative statements. So positive statements are economic statements based upon fact. Normative statements are based upon opinion. Positive is fact, normative is opinion. And normative statements, those of you doing multiple choice exams, normally contain the words ought or should. Ought or should. So if I said to you, smoking kills, well, that's fact. We know that is medically proven, that is fact. If I said to you, you ought to give up smoking, that is clearly an opinion. It's not a fact of any kind. You ought to. You should do. You should do more exercise. That is a normative statement. And a lot of economics is based upon normative analysis. But we'll get into that later as we go through this sequence of videos. Point number 4, needs and wants. I hope that you've noticed, as I've been discussing the basic economic problem here, I'm always referencing wants. It's the wants aspect which is the important part when we're talking about the basic economic problem, scarcity, choice, opportunity, cost. Wants are infinite for most people, unless you're a very contented person. And it is those infinite wants which lead to this problem of opportunity cost. Needs, on the other hand, are relatively limited. And when we're talking about needs, we're really talking about the bare essentials of life. We're talking about heat, light, clothing, shelter, food. Those are the basic needs that we're talking about. So whenever you're talking and discussing the basic economic problem, do be careful to talk about wants rather than needs. Very important. Point number 5, problems associated with making these choices. Well, for an individual, yes, they may be relatively difficult in the short term, but probably in the longer term you don't suffer too many setbacks because you consume one good instead of another. However, If it was to do with decisions made by the government, for example, then that's slightly different. Because, of course, the government has a whole pot of tax revenue, and it has to decide where to divvy out that revenue. Should some of it go on health? Should some of it go on education? Should some of it go on defence? Etc., etc. And of course the problem is that the government's resources, just like a household's, just like an individual's, the government's resources are not infinite. And so if more money is pumped into, let's say, the healthcare sector, well, maybe that means that teachers don't get a pay rise for 10 years. Or maybe it means that the Tornado jet, which I believe has just been decommissioned, the final flight was just last week, it means that defence does not get a whole raft of new Typhoon fighters, for example, to replace the Tornado jet. So from a government's perspective, this whole notion of scarcity and choice is much more, it's a much bigger problem, isn't it? And we would, of course, normally illustrate this by way of a diagram, a production possibility curve diagram. So there are lots of possible alternatives to this, but let's just keep it to health and education, for example. So you'll be familiar with the PPC or the PPF like so. And if we're at point X, that means we've got X1 of healthcare and X1 of education. If the government decides to pump more money into health, well, the PPC shows all of the government's resources, the maximum. And so if we decide to go to Y, where we've got Y1 of health, so we've got more healthcare, but then as a consequence of that, we have to reduce the amount of education. And that's a great diagram, as I'm sure you well know, for illustrating opportunity cost. Because the opportunity cost of increasing health from here is that distance of education. You're reducing education by Y1 minus X1, or X2 rather. So remember your production possibility curve. That comes probably in the next video anyway, and we'll say a little bit more about that. Okay, point number 6, the economic agents. So I've mentioned them already. Government, firms and households. These are our key economic agents. What do they do? Well, what to do. Government are said to have a paternal role. So they have a role in looking after us as their citizens, as the elected representative of the citizens. They have a duty of care toward us, be that in the form of providing us with lots of public services or benefits in kind, as you might say. The government, of course, has a bigger role in some countries than in others, depending upon the amount of mixing in the economy, and that whole notion of the structure of the economy is something that we'll come back to. Firms, of course, are generally speaking privately owned, profit-seeking enterprises, and the UK, of course, is made up, generally speaking, of SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. Not really huge conglomerates and huge, enormous, large firms in the UK. Generally, we're talking about SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. And then the household, of course, is predominantly responsible for buying the goods and services which the firms produce. Which brings us nicely into point number 7, the factors of production. The households, of course, the labourers, they are one of the factors of production. So you've got land, labour, capital, enterprise. So what do we mean by each of those? So land, natural resources. Labour, that's human effort. That's physical and mental. So you could be a plumber, very practical, physical, or you could be a research scientist, so using your brains all the time. Capital, we're talking about machinery specifically. An enterprise, we're talking about somebody who's got an idea and brings the other resources together in order to bring that idea to market and hopefully make a profit, but not always, of course. Now, what are the returns to these? So, in the case of enterprise, you'll either make a profit or a loss. In the case of land, then the the return to that is rent. Labour is wages, and capital is interest. For reason, and we'll just leave it at that. We'll not get into the reasons why. So rent, wages, interest, profits, land, labour, capital, and enterprise. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so that's kind of a very quick summary of the content of the first section of the specification. So I look forward to hopefully bringing you one of these a day for the next X numbers of days. Bye for now.